Hi friends, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on the 11 books that I read in July. So let's just hop right into the video. So the first book that I read in July is a highly anticipated read for myself, and that is Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. This is a piece of nonfiction that looks at how language is used to manipulate people and how language works in cults. It also explores the difference between a Jim Jones style cult and the cult online followings, the cult of influencers. And so Montell looks at the language tactics used in what is traditionally thought of as a cult. Basically, a lot of new religions fall into cults. There's a joke that cult plus time equals religion. It was really interesting to see how a lot of the tactics used by traditional cults, what we think of as a cult, get used in multi-level marketing, in like wellness trends, in gym and fitness trends, in social media marketing trends, and how that language that creates its own in-group can be used to manipulate people. I thought it was a fascinating read, and I am so glad that one of my hyped books for this year has lived up. Several of the hyped books so far in 2021 have just disappointed me, so I love that I loved this. I finished this on July 1st. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and this was a new buy for me. So the next book that I read in July is The Skin We're In by Desmond. This is a book that exposes racism in Canada, specifically Toronto. And so it's a year of Cole chronicling racism in Canada, like systemic racist issues, the police brutality that we see in the States as Canadians. It's happening right here too, but our media doesn't pick up on it in the same way that it gets picked up on in the States. I think it was important for me as a white settler Canadian to read about racism in Canada, to remind myself that all of these things that I see on social media happening in the States happen in Canada too. You can't have a nation that is built on racism and genocide not be racist. And I feel like it's so easy to point to our neighbors to the south and be like, well, we're not as bad as them, but like, we are. We have the same colonial, genocidal, racist roots. We're not that different. The thing that stood out to me from this book that I have to admit that I'm not super aware of is Canada's immigration policies. Like, the thing is, you can only do so much as one human. Like, if you try and care a little bit about everything, like, you're gonna burn yourself out, or you're just gonna stop caring. I hadn't paid attention at all to Canada's anti-Black immigration policies and refugee policies. So I think it was a good reminder that there is more going on outside of what I am personally paying attention to and supporting. I finished The Skin We're In on July 3rd. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and it was a new buy. The next book that I read was The Kraken Wakes by Wyndham. So I did a cleaning up my TBR vlog. I went through my first ever book haul, and this was one of the books in my first ever book haul on YouTube. I will link that video above. This is my third Wyndham and my least favorite Wyndham. Wyndham does a lot of speculative fiction, sci-fi-ish stuff. The concept is that aliens have come and have colonized the deepest parts of our oceans. Humans being humans, we decide to like poke and prod this species, bomb them, annihilate them, rather than just letting them live in the parts of the planet that we do not use at all. Wyndham chronicles humans being humans and being unnecessarily reactionary and violent, and that causes a chain reaction of violence. The pacing was slow, like so slow. It was often very detailed in terms of science things that I don't particularly care about. Like I don't care about the science in my fiction functioning accurately. Like I don't need to hear about scans and all that jazz. However, the concept was engaging, and every time I picked it up, I sat there for a long time working my way through it. So it was slow paced but engaging. Parts of it felt very close to the climate crisis thinking that we're experiencing right now. I don't think when it was written we were really thinking about the impact of a climate crisis, but in 2021, that's very much where it sat. I don't know that I would recommend this unless you are a John Wyndham completionist. I don't think it is one of my favorites. Like, I definitely like The Day of the Triffids and The Chrysalids more. I'm not mad I read it, but I don't know that I would recommend it. I finished this on July 4th. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and this was from my TBR. So then I started filming a vlog where I read all of the arcs that I had requested or been sent in the early half of 2021 that are all coming out in the fall of 2021. The first thing that I read was an arc of Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Silvia Moreno-Garcia wrote Mexican Gothic, which I did enjoy. I know it's a little bit of a polarizing book. This book, Certain Dark Things, feels very different, and that is sort of the impression that I get from her writing, that she's always exploring different pieces of genre horror fiction. This is very much noir film inspired, and it reads that way. And so while I feel like it did what it set out to do, at times I felt the writing was a little bit cheesy and tedious. Like, I didn't super love the writing, even though I think it nailed what it wanted to do. This is set in Mexico City, in a world where vampires exist. They are public knowledge, and we see how more developed nations had these systems in place to evict vampires from their spaces, leaving the vampires to flee to the developing world. Countries with less resources to deal with incoming colonizing European vampires, and how that has sort of thrown off the ecosystem, thrown off the relationships with the local indigenous vampires. We have a conflict happening between two drug lord vampires, a European Godoy family of vampires, and a indigenous, like, Aztec group of vampires, and there's basically a gang war happening between the indigenous vampires and the European colonizing vampires. Folks get dragged in. It's a little bit messy. The one thing that I really appreciated about this is that Moreno-Garcia took inspiration from the vampire folklore that exists around the world and turned those, like, quirks of each local folklore into a different species of vampire. But overall, I didn't love this work. I have no desire to reread this book. So I finished this on July 9th. I ended up giving this advanced reader copy a 3 out of 5 stars. So I guess I'm counting this in terms of my stats tracking as a new buy. It's fitting in with the new things opposed to something that I have purchased and is part of my physical TBR. Arcs were something that I hadn't really considered when I was stats tracking. The next book that I read is also part of that arc reading vlog, and it is an arc of Light from Uncommon Stars by Ryka Aoki. So this is so good. It sounds a little bit bananas. Like, I heard about all of the moving pieces. This is the one where the publishers reached out and they were like, so we see you've read Becky Chambers and you liked Becky Chambers. We think you might like this. And at first I looked at all of the pieces and I was like, this sounds kind of wacky, but I'll give it a chance. So we have Shizuka Satomi, who is a famous violin teacher who has agreed to trade the souls of 7 violin prodigy students to a demon in exchange for immortality. We also have Katrina, who is a teenaged trans girl who has run away from her transphobic parents. She has run off to LA, and she is a violinist. The third moving component is the Tran family, who are space aliens escaping an intergalactic space war. They are hiding out on Earth. They have purchased a Vietnamese-owned donut shop and are replicating perfect soulless donuts. It sounds very like disparate, and you're like, how is this going to work? But it does. It all weaves together beautifully. I totally get the Becky Chambers vibes, the found family, the queer relationships. It's beautiful. The violin nerdiness in it is also great. I really liked the openings that this left for future books in the series. Like, there's a lot of world that's sort of lightly touched on that I think would be fascinating to explore. And I can see a sort of loosely interconnected series somewhat akin to Becky Chambers' Wayfarer series. I could also see like a very like linear connected series happening, and I'm excited for it. I loved this. I would highly recommend it to anyone who loves that soft queer sci-fi, that like Becky Chambers hug type of sci-fi. So I'm so glad that I agreed to accept this copy in exchange for an honest review. I finished that on July 12th. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and this was an arc, so it was new. Then I went into my next arc, which was Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. I made it 10% of the way into this arc before DNFing it. I personally found the writing atrocious. In my opinion, it is bad writing that is either overwritten, nonsensical, or it doesn't trust the reader. Like, she shows and then she tells you what you just showed in case you didn't see it. Like, she doesn't trust the reader to have seen what she's created. I made it 10% in to the sentence, and I will share this sentence even though you're not supposed to quote from an arc because it's an uncorrected proof, but this is the sentence that ended my desire to continue with this arc. Philip's expression cragged with the guilt he had held for years like a reliquary. This is a nonsense sentence that tells you nothing. It has a lot of big words in it that tell you nothing. The writing was very much like this, where it would throw in like a thesaurus word to seem fancier, but when you look at what that word means, it makes nonsense. So an expression cragged with guilt. So cragged as in the like craggy cliff sides of like a seaside cliff sort of idea is a crag. So his face is cragged with guilt. Does that mean it's lumpy, wrinkled, deep creased, like a flat face? Like, a crag doesn't do anything. It's cragged with guilt. It's a result of this because he's been holding on to this guilt for years like a reliquary. A reliquary is a holy container. Is his face the holy container? I assume that you hold on to a holy container with like awe and reverence. So is he holding on to his guilt with reverence, with awe? Like he's so impressed with his guilt? Like, it's when you break down what this means, it means nonsense. It doesn't tell you anything about his expression, really. It's a bunch of fancy garbage words that ultimately mean nothing. There was another sentence where the characters jump and turn like cogs, like cogwork. So like in a clock, so you have the image of the characters turning, like interlocking. There's so many things where when you think about the visual that is evoked with these words, it's nonsensical. And I've seen other folks review this arc and say that the writing is beautiful and evocative and visually stunning. So some people enjoy this style of writing. I found it incredibly frustrating. Now that could be the difference between the type of reader that we are. Like, I tend to be a reader that very much paints a picture. And when you paint nonsense for me with the words, I cannot. I end up picturing the characters doing odd, inhuman actions, and I'm immediately drawn out of the book trying to picture what's going on. It could be that if you are a reader that doesn't really animate what you're reading, that you are able to get more into the story, which sounds fantastic. Like the premise of the story is these like rich dipshits go on a honeymoon to a haunted manor, and there's like these sacrificed brides in the manor. It's going to be like a horror style disaster trip. The pitch for it, the marketing for it sounded phenomenal. I personally was so frustrated. If this had been a physical arc, I would have been editing it the same way that I edit as somebody who's freelance edited. I would be marking it the same way I would as a teaching assistant, right? Like, language has power, and in this case, it pissed me off and I DNF'd it. I could not make it through it. Because this is an arc, it's an uncorrected proof, there is potentially room for improvement in some of this nonsense. However, I have never seen a book enter the arc phase and change dramatically. Like, there might be an opportunity for a slight typo edit if it's caught, but in my experience, the level of overhaul that I would personally want from this book to make it readable for myself is not something that would happen in the arc phase. Like, I anticipate the final copy being very much in this overly written style. This is very much not for me. If you are the type of reader that I am that animates as you read, this may not be for you. If you are somebody who doesn't animate, I think this is very much for somebody who doesn't animate in their mind as they go. DNF'd this on July 15th at 10%. I did sort of flick further through the arc, and like on any given page, these overly written nonsense bits popped out to me, and that influenced my decision to DNF this. So that was an arc. I accepted in exchange for an honest review. I feel like you very much got an honest review from me. Oh yes, there was another sentence. Here's another sentence that like I just like confirmed my nope. Philip made a bassoon noise deep in his lungs. So first of all, if you don't know what a bassoon sounds like, what does that mean to you? How does that bassoon noise help you as a reader picture the noise that Philip makes? If you do know what a bassoon that is played badly sounds like, it's Philip like squawking like a duck. Is Philip making some sort of deeply musical, beautiful bassoon noise because he's a talented bassoon player? Like, it's just this nonsense shit that like, it seems like it's beautifully written. It obscures more than it expands or illustrates. The next book that I read, again for that arc vlog, was Flowers for the Sea by Zin E. Rocklyn. This is a pen name, I believe, for Terry Zin. They are a queer Black person who battles with depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So you're going to see traumatic body horror in this book that was marketed as dark fantasy. The bios online for Zin indicate that they are a woman, but the bio at the end of this arc has them using they, them pronouns. So I am going to use they, them pronouns for this author to err on the side of caution. So this is a novella that is full of rage. Like, rage is the radiating emotion from this book. Iraxi is a woman who is othered in some way. She is othered from the folks in the village. She's very much ostracized on this ship. She's also one of the few women on this ship in this like post-apocalyptic world. There's been a lot of flooding. Everybody's on an ark now. They initially were doing quite well on the ark. It was self-sustaining, had like a farm on it, whatever, lots of rations. And so they lived in a time of plenty on the ark, and now everything is going to shit. Their onboard garden is dying, and everybody is miserable as they slowly sail towards death in this ruined world. Something has happened to make most women infertile, unable to carry a child to term, or to, if they give birth to that child, the child dies. Araxi is very heavily pregnant at the beginning of this book. She does not want to be pregnant. She does not want to be a mother, but it very much looks like the child that she is going to give birth to will be one of the few children that does survive in this new world. A lot of the novella chronicles her very painful, graphic birthing of this child. I mean, it was beautifully written. Definitely a novella, more of a snapshot into this world. In every way that I was turned off by Nothing But Blackened Teeth's writing, this writing I thought was exquisite, and I would love to see what else this author has produced. Like, this is definitely an author that I will be keeping an eye on in terms of what they publish. If you like Octavia E. Butler's work, I think you will like Zin E. Rocklyn's work. So I finished this on July 16th. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and this was an arc, so it was new to me. The next book that I read was Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. Joshua Whitehead is a queer two-spirit OG Cree member of the Pegui First Nation land now known as Manitoba. He is a poet and a PhD candidate. This very much is an Own Voices text. So Jonny is a queer two-spirit OG Cree person who has moved to the city. He's moved from the res to the city, and he survives in the city doing sex work. So he is a cam person. He very much performs, and he's sort of fetishized for his indigeneity. So it's very much looking at identity and performance. It also looks a lot at the experience of growing up queer and two-spirit on the res. So a two-spirit person is a part of Indigenous culture. However, colonialism has been very effective in placing gender binaries and Christian ideas around sexuality into Indigenous communities. And so Jonny grows up facing a lot of hardship, a lot of homophobia. I genuinely don't know if transphobia would be the umbrella that, like the umbrella term for the gender policing that happens for two-spirit folks. Like, two-spirit is specifically an Indigenous term. It is specific to Indigenous people. White settlers cannot be two-spirit. That is not for us. Like, non-binary or like gender queer is for us. I'm genuinely not sure if Indigenous two-spirit folks would see themselves under the umbrella of experiencing transphobia. Like, if that is just the umbrella language that we have at this point. So I am going to use transphobia to evoke the fear and the prejudice and the abuse that Jonny experiences because of his two-spirit presentation of gender, his living of gender, because that is something that he deals with on the res that now thinks in terms of the colonial gender binary, and Jonny falls outside of that gender binary as a two-spirit person. So we very much see him bullied and abused. There's a lot of gay sex in this book. I made the mistake of Googling the term bottoming out in terms of queer sex and ended up looking at a prolapsed rectum. I looked at an image of a prolapsed rectum. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. But I did learn something new. I also really loved the relationship between Jonny and his grandmother. So his kokum is an elder, and she is very much accepting of his queer two-spirit identity in ways that his stepfather and mother aren't so supportive of. We have an intergenerational relationship and like a passing on of knowledge and medicine with his kokum. I loved this story. I will now read anything that Joshua Whitehead produces. I think his writing is gorgeous. I also think it's really important that it's Indigenous literature set on the land that we now call Manitoba. We very rarely see Indigenous lit set outside of Ontario or BC. And there are obviously Indigenous populations all over the land now known as Canada, surviving despite the genocidal colonial agenda. I think it's really important to see voices from other communities in publishing. Please read it. Please put it on your library holds list. Get your hands on a copy and experience this story. I finished this on July 18th. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars at the time. However, as it has sort of percolated and lived in my mind over the month, I think this actually deserves a 5 stars. I think this is a new favorite, which is what a 5-star is for me. Like, a 4-star is still a phenomenal book, but a 5-star is like a favorite. I think I have a new favorite author here. I could definitely see myself rereading this, and this was a new buy. The next book that I read is, again, a very highly anticipated book for this year, and I loved it. This is A Psalm for the Wild Bills by Becky Chambers. We have queer, warm hug goodness in Becky Chambers here. This is the start of a new series, the Robot and the Monk and Robot series. So we have a monk who has this calling to change professions, I suppose. So they start out as a garden monk, and they don't feel that they're doing the best work there. And so Dex feels called to be a self-taught tea monk. So they get their little bicycle, portable camper, tiny house thing, and they go out into the community, into a place where tea monks generally are not, and they serve the community by brewing and mixing teas and listening to people and basically doing a lot of like therapy and community outreach work. And they do this until they become burnt out. And then they decide to travel off the beaten path into the wilderness, and they encounter a robot. When robots became sentient, humans decided to let them run free and have no more connections with smart technology. Dex encounters a robot for the first time in many, many years, and there's a coming together, a learning that is happening, and I assume that throughout the rest of the series we're going to see the robot and the monk explore what it means to be human. I read this in an evening. I'm so excited for the rest of this series to see what this monk and this robot do together, the ruminations on what it means to be human. There's a lesson here about feeling lost, I think. The monk feels very lost. They want a purpose and a meaning for their life, and the robot is very much asking them, like, why? Why do you need a purpose to have your life be worth something? Is living not just enough? So I think if you're ever feeling lost, this could be a good book for you. I think I will probably come back to this whenever I'm feeling lost, for this like warm hug and reminder that like your life is worth living even if you aren't doing grandiose world-changing things. Like, the act of living and being is enough. I finished that book on July 18th. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and that was a new buy. That was actually a pre-order, and I'm very pleased with myself for actually reading the pre-order in the month that it came in, because I've gotten a little bit slack on that. The next book that I read is the Patron Drop-In Book Club book for July. We have a live show for this in August, probably already passed by the time you see this video, and that is The End We Start From by Megan Hunter. So this is a weird little post-apocalyptic climate crisis novel that is about motherhood also. I have to do a little bit of research and thinking, and I will probably reread this before I host the live show. We have an unnamed woman who is heavily pregnant when London gets a warning that there may be some incoming flooding and that they may have to evacuate because their neighborhood is probably going to be affected. They sort of put off moving because then the warning gets taken back, and then she's in the hospital, she gives birth, and like on the day that she gives birth, their neighborhood floods. And so her husband, who only goes by the initial R, everybody else in this book, there's an unnamed woman, and then everybody else in this book goes by a single letter. So her husband R becomes this sort of like survivalist guy. Like, he's very much like a abandoned community, live on my own in nature. And so he goes to his parents, and like we see the impact of like food shortages and riots. The unnamed woman eventually demands that they live in a refugee camp because she wants community support for her newborn. She wants access to medicine. So the themes that I'm thinking about at this point that I am going to look at and form further thoughts. I'm probably going to talk about this again in August when I reread the book and after I've sort of done some research and put some notes together, so look forward to more fully fleshed out thoughts on this book. I want to think about the biblical allusions, the idea of floodwaters coming in and cleansing a modern city. I want to look at what it says about the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, what it says about motherhood, and also refugee experience. Those are the things that I'm thinking about. Overall, this book is very sparse, from like the unnamed characters to the single letters of the characters. A couple weeks later, I'm left more feeling like this book is a mood than a story. What little details there were are slipping, and it very much feels like a Pinterest mood board around motherhood and climate change opposed to like a tight narrative, and I have to think about the intentionality of that as well. So I finished this on July 22nd. My thoughts on this are very half-formed, and I'm hoping to have more fully formed thoughts in August. I'm not sure yet whether I would recommend this or not, so hold on that. My initial reaction to this is a 3 out of 5 stars. It's okay. I think it's a good book club book. Like, I think there will be a lot to discuss here. 2 more books. I then read The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. So there has been a lot of like online Twitter drama around The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I will try and find the book community video that Jess Owens did on it and link it down below. Basically, this was already on my library holds list, and I decided to leave it on my library holds list after the Twitter drama just to form my own opinion on it. The issue seems to be that this book has been out for a while and folks loved it because we have like queer representation, we have the acceptance of the other in these like magical children, being accepted by the community, finding a loving foster home, like a found family narrative. It very much reminds me of the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire in that aspect, like children finding a home where they belong, where they're allowed to be themselves. But then TJ Klune has claimed that he was inspired by the residential school system to write this book. And I think the outrage is that the residential school system was a government and church sanctioned genocide project that tortured and abused and murdered Indigenous children in this larger genocidal project, this nation-building project in Canada. I mean, it happened in the States as well, but they weren't called residential schools, so specifically evoking the residential school system in Canada. The idea that this orphanage, this stand-in for the residential school system, is a good place where you find family, you find love, you're allowed to be yourself, is like categorically not what a residential school system did. I can see why, if Klune is saying that that was his inspiration, what the fuck is he doing? Did he just make it seem like residential schools are a good place to be and like were great for the Indigenous kids there? They were very much not. I read this book looking for the residential school connections, and I almost feel like they're not there. Like, either Klune has only said this after the fact to try and appear relevant with what is being uncovered at the residential schools in Canada right now, the mass graves, the unmarked graves of hundreds of Indigenous children that died in these schools. So either he's trying to somehow make himself more relevant and appear woke by saying this inspired him, or he has vastly misunderstood what a residential school is. Like, if you take that statement out, this is a great book. This is a great story about found family, about acceptance, about Linus, our caseworker at the Department for Magical Children, learning to be more empathetic and open to difference. That even doesn't make sense to me, that Linus shuts down orphanages that he does find abuse happening in, which would make him a very bad caseworker, but he's considered a very good caseworker for extremely upper management. They send him on this assignment to inspect this orphanage on the island because he's very thorough and very good. But if he was shutting down schools that were working to wipe out Indigenous magical children, you would think that he would be doing a bad job and fired, because the goal of the school is to destroy Indigenous children, destroy magical children, and not have them loose as members in the community, right? So like, there are so many things when you try and read this in the frame of a residential school, it just doesn't work. I almost felt this more had like Orwellian 1984 vibes with this government involved. I felt Wayward Children vibes with the orphanage. And I really don't know what to do with this book. I finished this on July 29th. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars just in terms of enjoyment. I don't know what to do with the residential school piece, because even if you try and read it in, it really doesn't work. Like, even if it was his intention to glorify the residential school system as like a great place to find family, it just doesn't work as a fantasy metaphor for unpacking that history. Like, I would never use this book as like a teaching tool, as a jumping off point to get young people thinking about the history of residential schools, for instance. I don't know that I would recommend it. And the final book that I read in July, have I been saying June? I meant July. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. So this is one of those things where it seems like a lot of authors are trying to obscure their gender based on the premise that we have a book club of housewives who are going to work together to slay a vampire and protect their community. And the name Grady didn't ping in my brain as like a man's name. I was under the impression that this would fit into my Women in Horror series. And it very much does not, because the Women in Horror series is looking at how women write about women in horror literature. And this is a man writing about women in horror literature. I mean, it was fun. I devoured it over a couple of days. Patricia is the stay-at-home wife who's given up her career to take care of her children, and like the book club that she has is like her one thing that she looks forward to. It's her one escape. It's a chance to not be a wife and a mother, to read trashy crime novels and talk about them with a group of women. When a handsome stranger moves in next door, she's like excited and intrigued by him at first, but then weird shit starts happening, and all of these like serial killer crime books get her running this investigation of James Harrison. She believes that he is murdering the children in the Black community outside of this white suburb, and is continually gaslit and betrayed by everybody in her life, including her husband, who medicates her, institutionalizes her briefly before bringing her out and medicating her even more heavily. In the back half of the book, there is so much gaslighting by the men. There is abuse, there is sexual assault, sexual violence. Like, there's just such an intimate violation of women's bodies in the back half of this book. There's something about a man imagining what that violence would be like and that gaslighting would feel like, that just sort of turned me off. Overall, it's a really fun read if you just sort of turn your brain off and absorb into the text. But thinking about it from my angle of like examining women in horror, gender representation, like it doesn't fit. I'm left sort of unsure what to do with this because I was very excited to review this for my Women in Horror series, and it doesn't count. So it almost feels like everything that I was collecting about like the gender critique from a woman's perspective just doesn't matter because it's not a woman writing this book. So that's totally on me. But unfortunately that has sort of impacted the experience that I'm left with this book. So I finished this on July 30th. I am giving it 3 out of 5 stars. It was a fun read. It was a fun thriller vampire book. Like, I am personally disappointed because of my own failure to, I guess, look into this book further. And so I borrowed that book from the library. That brings me to the end of this video, the end of my July wrap up. I think overall it was a very successful month. I had a lot of hits. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books in the comments down below. If you liked what you saw here today, consider giving this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. Before we go, we also have to thank my patrons who help make videos like this possible. Their support is amazing and much appreciated. Links to the Patreon page are in the description box down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye!